So just to kind of know, so there are what are the three for profiling? Yeah. So just to reiterate, since we just started the recording, so this introduction, the series of tutorials here, these are very nice. The first five, no, the examples or they're really good. You should go through them. The homework that we are going to formulate will be around this. Second thing is be aware of this. No, this is again a very important, nice resource. This particular URL, and specifically, I recommend you to read this profiling, optimizing, and debugging the application. And this, yeah, this part. Okay. The other parts are also nice. You should have these things ready, and you should keep reading them. Yeah, there are no specific books for this course, so primarily manuals and tutorials, and so these are the, we have to use them to learn. And then also there is so this is many times you will see in the programs OpenCL calls being used. So you should have access to this OpenCL documentation, so that when you get a doubt, what is this particular argument in this particular function doing, you can go check the original OpenCL specification. So now let's look at, so we will look at what is called as an Amdahl's law in, and then we will see how we can use Amdahl's law to analyze the application that we are trying to study. So if you take an application, you can see that there is a Colab notebook here, and so let's say if you take an application and S represents, you can see here, so 0.2 means the 20% of the application is a serial part. You will not be able to parallelize it. You will not be able to accelerate it. Either you use GPUs or multi-core CPUs or FPGAs, you will not be able to accelerate that part. So let's say 20%. That we are in terms of fraction, 0.2 is the fraction. 0.2 is not the percentage; it's the fraction. And the parallel section is given by 1 minus S. So if the whole program takes the serial, if it takes one time unit to run this program on a sequential processor, where both the parallel and serial part are just run in a sequential fashion, and then if you take the parallel part, and if you use n, if you obtain a factor of n speed up on the parallel part, either by using n cores or by using some other mechanism, then the overall speed up that we get, is this. So that in the denominator, we have the new execution time. Okay, so 1 unit is the original execution time, and the denominator gives you the execution time by using when we are able to obtain a factor of n speed up. This factor of n speed up you may obtain using n square resources, or or whatever way you adopt. That's all right. But if you are able to get n resources, if you are able to get a factor of n speed up, then this is what we can. For the sake of simplicity, just assume that we have n cores, and because of that, and we are able to get a perfect speed up on the parallel portion, then this is the speed up that we get. This is the overall program speed up that we get. Right? So one thing we can, let's say if S is equal to half 0.5, then what is the best speed up that we can get, no, even using whatever the fancy techniques that we have that are available for us. If n is the, if S is equal to 0.5, that is 50% of the code is serial and the rest of the 50% is parallelizable, then what is the best we can get? What's the best? Can someone type in the chat box or unmute and tell me? Any answers here? Am I audible? 1 by S. Huh? Okay. So what happens is, yeah, so if S is equal to 1 by S, so the best speed up that we can get is 2x. Best speed up that we can get is 2x speed up, 2 times speed up that we can get. So in general, if you see, if you see limit as n tends to infinity, that is, so if you look at this speed up, this of n, then what we have is this p by n goes to 0, and we will get 1 by s. So if S is equal to half, then what happens is, if this, that is, if the serial portion is half, then so serial portion, if it is half 0.5, then max overall speed up, that we can get is 2. If the serial portion is 1/3, then the max speed up that we can get is 3. And if the serial portion is 1/5, then the max speed up that we can get is 4. And if the serial portion is 20%, then the max speed up we can get is 5. Okay, so on and so forth. Right, and if the serial portion is 1/10, that is 1/10 is 0.1. So is 10%, then it is the max speed up that we can get is 10. So on and so forth. So this is important because when you take an application and when you are trying to do the speed up, and if you analyze this part, and if you analyze what is the function that you are trying to accelerate, and what is the fraction of the overall program execution time that particular function is taking, then you can know that by working hard, so even in the best case, what is the max speed up you will be able to achieve. So this is what is famously called as an Amdahl's law, and it is of very much importance for us. So if we run this program, so here in this notebook, so for S is equal to 0.2, that is 20%. If we import. So we can see that the max speed up that we can achieve, even if you use 100 processors or 100 cores, is 5, and that's what this table indicates. Similarly, let's say if I make this equal to 0.5 and run this code, then you can see asymptotically you can this is the max speed up that you can get. And in fact, you can see somewhere around here, this is the inflection point So after this point, maybe around the 10 cores or something like that, there is no point in going further, because the benefits that you get tapers. So when you are trying to expedite an application, when you're so you try to identify this thing, what is the parallel portion and parallelizable portion, and what is the best speed up that you can get for the overall application. So related to this, there is something called as, so if you see, this may give a pessimistic picture that, that like, for example, even if the serial portion is, let's say, 0.1, then the maximum speed up that we can we can get is 10, and you may think, what's the point? Okay, what's the point in using a HPC cluster with 100 GPUs in it, for example, right? So there is one interesting thing that you have to keep in mind when you are trying to use this analysis. That is what is called as a Gustafson's law. So this law, what it says is, usually as the parallel computing resources increase, let's say there's one particular job, so there is one particular workload that we are doing. So that particular workload, so it has two parts, the parallel part and the serial part. So so serial plus parallel. But as the number of resources increase for us, okay, as the number of resources increase, so maybe n machines or n cores, whatever we think of, as the number of resources increase, then we will be able to do more, the amount of work that we can handle proportionately increases. In Amdahl's law, the amount of work is fixed. Okay, so the total amount work is fixed, and we are trying to figure out what is the max speed up that we can achieve. But Gustafson's law says there are many applications, especially these big data applications, as the number of nodes increase, then we will be able to, each node will be able to process more amount of data. So accordingly, the data size also increases. So with n machines, the workload increases. The workload increases from S plus P to S plus NP. S plus P to S plus NP. All right. And then if we are trying to figure out, if we are trying to, so once the workload increases, then what happens is the scope for parallelization. So if you take this ratio, what is the speed up when we compare with the original application? Then the scale factor also increases. Just give me 1 minute. Yeah, it's yeah. So if you look at the scale, then this is something like S plus NP divided by S plus P. This is S plus NP divided by S plus P. So the scale also increases. Okay. So keep this in mind that we should take Amdahl's law with a pinch of salt. while it is applicable to many of the HPC applications that we kind of work with. So in many HPC applications, Amdahl's law kind of works, but in big data applications where we may have to refer to Gustafson's law to kind of figure out the limit of what we can achieve using parallelization and acceleration. All right. So now let's try to use Amdahl's law and try to understand what is possible with our. We looked at the vector add example last time, and let's try to analyze this vector add example. In the vector add example that we worked with, the vector size is set to 4096. It is set to 4096, and the size of each element is 4 bytes. So the total vector size is 4096 into 4 in terms of bytes. And there are two input vectors. So we have so input and data. It's the size of the input data is 2 times the vector, and the size of output data is equal to vector size. And we are performing one addition operation for every for corresponding pairs of elements in the two vectors A and B. So therefore, overall, the number of computations that we do is 4096. And if you compute the compute intensity, that is the number of operations per byte, the number of operations per byte, you can easily see it is 0.125. The reason is, so we are adding one addition per 8 bytes because there are 2 elements we are adding. The size of each element is 4 bytes. So there are overall 8 bytes. So the compute intensity is 0.125. Whenever you are trying to perform any kernel for trying to consider a kernel for acceleration, a chunk of your program for acceleration, the first thing that you need to do is compute this, compute the compute intensity of that program. Like if it is matrix vector multiplication, what is the compute intensity? If it is matrix multiplication, what is the compute intensity? If it's a convolution operation, what is the intensity? So this compute intensity is something which you have to check. And there is one more thing here. You can see this is PCIe equal to 16. So PCIe express bandwidth. So this is, so we transfer the data from the host main memory to the device global memory using PCIe Express bus. And PCI Express bus, it turns out to be a bottleneck. So you can see 16 GB on. You should check, like for example, on your machine or on Amazon FPGA F1 instance. What is the one? What is the PCIe bandwidth? What is the PCIe bandwidth that's available? You should check. And there is apparently there is one command of which Xilinx provides, using which you can estimate the available PCIe bandwidth on the system on which the Xilinx runtime environment is running. Okay, so check the PCIe bandwidth on your system. But usually it goes from 16 GB per second to 64 GB per second. Check the PCIe bandwidth. This so in any application, so yeah, let's wait. That's what we are coming to here. So the first component that we have is we have to transfer the data from the host memory to FPGA device memory. This is step one, you can see here. And here we can see on the denominator, you have the PCIe bandwidth. Yeah, so we have the PCIe bandwidth. So yeah, on the denominator, anyway, you look at the expression clearly later. But overall, what, no, so this particular line, it computes. If the PCIe bandwidth is 16 gigabytes per second, how much time does it take to transfer 40, no, the input data for vector addition from host to memory? And then the actual kernel computation time is 832 nanoseconds. And we will see where it is coming from. It's an estimate. And the third is what is the FPGA to host time. After we compute the results, we transfer the data back from FPGA to host memory, and this is the time. So there is a total communication cost here, that is host to FPGA plus FPGA to host time. And there is a kernel time, and there is the overall speed up. The overall speed up, that is, if you apply Amdahl's law, the communication part, if you see, so there's a communication time TC1 plus kernel execution time TK plus let me use a different notation. So if you see here, T host to FPGA plus T kernel time, T FPGA to host time, this is the overall execution time. So you do all your fancy stuff, and if you are able to reduce even this kernel time to 0, then no, close to 0, negligible, then what happens is your communication overhead will still be there because you have to transfer the data from the host to FPGA and back. And if you do this computation, you will see that the best speed up that you can get is 1.58. If I'm right, so we're all doing computations. So speed up doesn't have units. So the best speed up that we can get is 1.6. That is 50% speed up you will get. That is because if you see there's a lot of overhead in the communication, and that communication overhead we are not able to mask in the particular way in which we have written the program. So what we have to do in the, we will take a brief detour and then come back to this particular point. Our goal is to see how we can hide this communication cost, which is kind of limiting the speed up that is possible, that is achievable for us. So Kalesha, go ahead. So what's your question?
So sir, here in the host to FPGA time, means here input that then dividing by the PCI, that formula, can you explain?
Sorry?
The formula,
the formula, think about it. That is, the data is in bytes, and I want to convert it into gigabyte units. Since PCIe speed is in gigabytes. So when we do all these things, no, we will, yeah. So, and we want the time in seconds. So you check that formula. So instead of time in,
does it mean lower speed up is efficient, sir?
Lower speed up is
efficient system?
No.
Means any
not
no,
it's not good. No, it is from a end-to-end vector addition. So because you are comparing this time.
See, sir, means kernel time we have to reduce, right? Means if
No,
we
no,
increase
not the
the kernel
kernel
time,
time. No. That is cheating, no? So not that. Yeah, maybe I didn't get your question.
my
So
question is
we
in
want to
this.
compare the time.
Yes.
See, we want to compare. This is the overall time required for computation.
Yes, sir.
Using accelerator, we have to compare it with the time taken if you do the vector addition just using CPU.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Okay, so that is the goal. What we are trying to get to is, even if you accelerate your kernel computation time superbly, almost making it no, just like magically compute it in an instant, then also your the speed up that is achievable is not great. So let's say TK is the time. Let's say yeah. So still you are able to get only 50% speed up because communication cost you are not able to hide.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Does it make sense?
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so you can see the total communication cost. We are trying to compute the communication cost in in nanoseconds. So because the kernel time is in nanoseconds, we want to match it in nanoseconds. So this is so you can see the ratio. The compute to the kernel time to communication ratio is approximately 1:2. So this is 1. If you think this kernel time as 1 unit, then approximately communication time is 2 units. So overall, out of 3 units of computation, or no, or put it in another way, so communication to kernel, this is equal to, so 1:2:1. So 2/3 of the time is we are spending in just data transfer. We are only 1/3 of the time is the computation happen. Great. So now let's go and see for all the problems, no, for the project that you will be working on, instead of while we do lots of, you end up doing lots of engineering, no, trying to improve that, trying to improve this. You need to have the clarity of thought on where what is going, what are the bottlenecks, no, and you need to have an analysis of your system. Okay, this a kind of a rough theoretical analysis of your system. So now let's go to what is HLS. So where is that the 232 832 latency, that 832 seconds, nanoseconds that we used here, it is coming from the White's hardware emulation. This is not hardware emulation. This is from that hardware. When we do synthesis, it estimated the latency of this whole thing as 208 clock cycles. So I would like you, I want to ask few questions now to you. So we have looked at this code before. We have looked at this code. Just to recap, if you see on the right hand side, or maybe let's use the White's. I'm not able to use that, but anyway, so let's see. This is the wide function we have seen in the last class. And so there is a loop in which no, there is an outer for loop which encapsulates the whole computation. And then yeah, and then what we have is there is one loop where we there is this first v1 underscore read loop. If you see here, this is the first loop wherein we read a chunk of data from the memory. And then there is a second loop v2 underscore read in which we are doing the actual computation. Remember the way we are doing things. So we have we bring 256 elements from the memory. We perform in the first loop, and then we perform addition on them in the second loop and store the result, and we keep repeating this process. This is the way we are doing. And if you look at the schedule viewer, or let's say the report, maybe, yeah. The report says that, yeah, before I ask this question, what are all the techniques that we used in order to improve the runtime, in order to improve the latency of this kernel from approximately 11,000 clock cycles to 200 clock cycles or 800 clock cycles? Actually, you know, when we did the computation, we got 8,000 clock cycles, some 3,000 clock cycles we are not able to account. So let's say we are able to reduce the number of clock cycles from the original VAD operation to 800 clock cycles. What are all the things that we did to be able to reduce, to get a tenfold increase, a tenfold speed up in the clock cycle? Can you put it in the chat so that it will be there? I would like you to see. So what are all the optimizations that we did in order to get a tenfold improvement speed up in the latency of the VAD kernel? Burst data transfer, pipelining, computing data in local memory, anything more? What else? What other techniques are used? Mayank, do you have? Mayank, Anjali, Chetan, Gayatri. What techniques did we use? You're all sleeping or what?
I don't remember, sir.
So I remember the data transfer thing that we transfer vector A and vector B to DDR memory to utilize the maximum throughput and pipelining.
So, okay, go ahead. What else, Gayatri?
That's it, sir. And I think cache did we use? I'm not sure. I think these are the two things that I remember clearly.
So the first important thing, really important thing that we did is we increased the DDR. Let me use share. This is very important. When we are thinking about computations, the first bottleneck that you will see is PCIe. So bottlenecks, okay? So PCIe bandwidth. And that's what we just try to figure out, no? 16 Gbps per 16 GB per second, no? That's and it depends on many other factors what exact bandwidth that we get, or we may get up to 64 Gbps we may get, depending upon how many PCIe lanes are there, things like that. But that's a one big it's a big bottleneck. Okay. If the amount of computation that you have to do, if the amount of computation that you have to do per data transfer, no, this is if this is a kind of PCIe bandwidth is a problem, then we can say this is IO bound. In the next class, we will look at what is called as a roofline analysis, but let's say this is one problem. And we will see know how to kind of work with it or work around this. The second problem is the DDR, no, DDR global device, DDR memory bandwidth. So in order to earlier, what we were doing is we are reading one element at a time. Okay, that is 32 bits at a time. Okay, original design. So if you see in the original device, so original design, in the, that is in just VAD, we are reading 32 bits, one element, or 32 bits at a time. This is what we were doing originally. And then yeah, and then what we did is, so we in the refined design, in the optimized design, wide underscore VAD. So first thing that we did is we were fetching 512 bits or 16 elements at a time. But not only that, so we were using 3 memory banks, DDR0, and I don't exactly remember the numbers, DDR1 and DDR2. So we are using 2 memory banks to store, to read the 2 input vectors, and 1 more memory bank to write data to the memory. Okay, so this is, okay, let's say in1 is present here, and this is going to have a phenomenal impact on the performance of your program immediately. Okay.
Sir, I have a query.
Yeah.
I understand that you have done to 512 bits. Even in my designs also, I generally do 512 bit. But sometimes what I've observed, especially with Intel compiler, is or burst coalescing is automatic. Even though if you write one element, when I see the simulations, I can see that 512 bit lane means the memory is automatically coalesced. Means doesn't it happen with this compiler? Means I understand. Even means I'm trying to say
It
even
looks
if you
like
write the code vaguely, it will automatically do it sometimes. That's what I feel. Means if there is scope for burst coalescing, it will do. Suppose if you're asking random addresses, obviously it would not do. But
yeah, I see.
So, but if
the
you're accessing content,
is understood, Prithvi. So the point, just to make it clear to others, the point Prithvi is saying is sometimes the compiler is See, there is one more reason also, I guess, Prithvi, in this particular case. I think what Prithvi is saying is, even if you write the code, without worrying about trying to just transfer 32 bits at a time, the compiler or the hardware will get the surrounding 512 bits of data from the global memory. And in the next call that you make, instead of making a fresh memory DDR memory transaction, the data that is buffered will be used. I think that is quite possible. That is quite possible. Yeah.
Okay, sir. But it is always a good practice to do properly anyway.
Yeah. So
With FITFUL bit.
Lavanya ma'am says that depends upon the memory controller hardware IP. So yeah, it makes sense, no? Like the DDR memory controller, how it is designed, depends on that also. So, but best thing is always to be explicit and not depend on the underlying DDR memory controller properties.
Yes.
And also the FIFO sizes of the buffers in the IP.
Yes. Yes.
This is the second thing. And the third, so this is DDR memory bandwidth is what we were using. And yeah, again, I got the same problem as just 1 minute. Okay. Okay, I will not be able to write anymore because I got some problem again, which I got last time. Okay. So yeah, anyway, so after this, we used vector. We have a loop in which, so after this, we have a loop in which, no, this vector sum, if you see this code, so we are generating a hardware structure where we can perform vector additions. Okay, so this is this is good. So this loop gets unrolled completely, and the amount of unroll is equal to the data width. And then so these are the three optimizations, and of course you can see that v1 underscore read operation, it is pipeline. Okay, that this loop is pipeline. The iteration latency for v1 underscore read is 3 clock cycles, but the throughput is every clock cycle one iteration gets completed. Similarly, the second loop on line number 116, so its latency is also, the iteration latency is 4 clock cycles, but the throughput is 1 iteration per clock cycle because overlapping happens. But there is one important thing that in this whole discussion, there is one important thing that is kind of missing, because if you see the iteration latency overall the latency for the loop V1 underscore read is 139 clock cycles, and the latency for the loop V2 underscore RD underscore add is 138. So if you add up these two latencies, the overall iteration latency for the outer loop will be something like 250 clock cycles. So it's not adding up. We just have 208 here. So what is happening here? So can someone explain how we are able to how the whole outer loop is able to execute in 208 clock cycles latency? What is happening there? What is happening? What is happening? Can anyone? Let's see. Guess, wild guess. Look at the code. Do whatever you want to do. Can someone tell me what is happening here? Where are we getting this benefit? So if you observe this code carefully, so you will see on line number 89, you will see that there is this Pragma HLS data flow. Okay, and then there are a couple of other Pragmas also, V1 underscore HLS stream variable, V1 underscore local depth, and V2 underscore local. There are on line number 89, 90, and 91, there are three important pragmas. They explain the story here. So if you go look at this data flow viewer, what is happening here is, you know, this the data, as data is produced, this module and this module, they are connected by a set of FIFO buffers. Okay, this loop. So we have the loop here. There is this module corresponds to the first loop, and this module corresponds to the second loop. And there are two buffers, FIFO buffers, which V1 underscore local and V2 underscore local, which are connecting these two loops. So the data that is read by this loop, it is streamed to the second module. So the second loop, it doesn't wait till the completion of the first loop. As soon as the data is available for the second loop will start executing. Okay, you can see, if you see this, you can see this channel. It has the size of, there are two FIFOs. The depth of the FIFO is 64. Each FIFO is 64. And the width of each FIFO is 512. So that's how data is being, using these FIFOs, data is being streamed between these two modules. And that's how these two iterations, they are running in parallel. They are running in a data flow fashion. As soon as data is available in the input stream or the input FIFO of the second iteration, it just goes ahead and executes it. And that is the magic behind this whole, why we are able to get, able to execute in this whole thing in around 200 clock cycles, because of this streaming of data from the output of one module to another module. So this turns out to be a very important technique in many image processing, video processing applications. So this is called as a producer module, and this is called as a consumer module. And producer and consumer, they are connected by FIFO. They are connected by FIFO.
Sir, here, did you instantiate those FIFOs between those basic blocks, or automatically they were?
It's not, it's automatically done. Once we use that Pragma, it gets instant, it will be automatically.
Okay. It is not pipe, right? It is not pipe. This is a FIFO, internal FIFO.
It's a FIFO, it's internal.
Okay, sir.
And
Okay,
if you
thank
can see in the report, you can see, say, report summary. Okay, if I keep going down, here are the VRAM modules used. Yeah, here it's, let's see. If you go to the right and see the number of VRAM modules used, VRAM blocks used, you will see 120. Earlier, we were using VRAM primarily for, I'm not sure actually whether this VRAM is used for, yeah, not sure. I think I'll hold my thoughts here. We definitely need VRAM for the local variables. Whether the FIFOs are also allocated on the VRAM, I am not sure. They can be allocated using registers also, using the register array also. It's quite possible. So you can check on this, whether some VRAM blocks are used for FIFOs or not. Yeah.
So can we not do this with the PCI also? Like the PCI acts as a producer and we take the data as like a consumer. So we essentially run our program in parallel while the PCI data is coming.
Yeah, we have to do equivalent to that. We don't have the same mechanism. That's true, Kunwar. Yeah, we don't have the same mechanism because the way data flow, etc., everything is realized is different. So, but an equivalent thing we have to do for PCIe also. One question. So here, when I look at this whole design, now it looks very. We are writing C code and then. Which is a sequential inherently, no, we are thinking sequentially and we are expecting the Vitis compiler to do something interesting things for us. And we are also sometimes it does some things which we are not aware of, or we try to use some pragmas to tell the compiler, hey, could you please do this for me? And all these things, right? So how many of you studied BlueSpec in this group? Is there anyone who looked at BlueSpec? BlueSpec system Verilog? Okay, no problem. So earlier I used to, some UG3 students who did intro to processor architecture. No, I think I didn't teach you BlueSpec maybe. Okay, so so this whole code, you know, this there is the C code, and then there is a C code with pragmas, and then there is a compiler, and then there are other things that we are doing outside this. No, like for example, telling through some user interfaces, we are telling which the input vector should be mapped to DDR0. So on and so forth. So there is all this clumsy picture of, there is no clear picture of this, the story. For an extremely simple example, such as VAD. But if you do the coding, but if you can express BlueSpec system Verilog, or maybe I'm not, I didn't use Verilog at all. So those of you who learned Verilog, so there, it is possible for us to have a very clean architectural specification. Like for example, in BlueSpec system Verilog, it's very nice. We can specify this whole thing very nicely. Pause. Something here. So let me see. Yeah. So we can specify this whole thing as this is module 1. So there is this module 1. This module 1 reads data. This is a read module. And so let me clear all. So there is a read module. And this read module, we can write it very, very cleanly. I mean, it's like, no, as they say, what you see is what you get. And so this reads data from DRAM and puts it in a FIFO structure. This is a FIFO using, and you explicitly declare this FIFO. There is no magic at all. And it's very easy to do. And there is a compute module which does this. And here you can optimize your compute module in whatever way, and then you put it in one FIFO, and then you can have a DRAM write module. This is so DRAM write. Let me use this. DRAM read. So this DRAM read, it goes to DDR memory, and so let's say in this particular case, this is DDR0, and so this one, so this accesses this DDR0 module, and this one nicely writes to DDR1, for example, or DDR2, whatever the output vector is. So this whole specification will be so crisp and so neat that when you look at the code, the whole architecture stares at you that this is what we are doing. So in terms of thought process, it's a very, in terms of the architecture specification, it is very, very clean, and you feel very comfortable. But the challenges that you get there is not in the architecture specification. It's so perfect, but the challenges that you get there is in moving data from the host to FPGA, from FPGA to host, and doing DRAM read or mapping, saying this particular thing should be, I should be reading from DDR0, or I should be reading data from DDR2. There are lots of low-level things that we have to do around the main architecture. So that figuring those things out turns out to be a real pain. Okay, BSV, if you see the BSV code, if you're for the same thing, you'll really fall in love with it, because it will just be what are called as a set of 3 rules, and those 3 rules are so clean and crisp, and no matter how, even if you want to build complex architectures, you will be able to kind of follow a similar model and be able to very nicely specify your architecture. But all the shell that is there, what we call as shell, for other low-level tasks, they turn out to be the very nightmare thing. Like, for example, here, instead of 32 bits, if you want to use 512 bits, you just change the data type and you are done. But if you go work at the BSV level, so there you get some kind of challenges. So that's a kind of bit unfortunate, personally, because if you can kind of stitch the BSV system with the outer shell in a very nice fashion, then our development process will be very, very clean. So to this effect, right now, BSV, it's an open source. Earlier, it's not open source. It is from MIT. Professor Arvind's lab. Now it's open source. There's a company, BlueSpec company. But now there is a competing thing called Chisel. I strongly, this is from Berkeley, UC Berkeley. If I'm right, this is from UC Berkeley. So Chisel also has this goal that, you know, architecture specification is should be simple, and it needs to follow some good principles. So Chisel and BSV, they compete with each other. Both are good, but I don't have any experience with Chisel. But I suspect, again, unless lot of hard work is done around Chisel, this shell, what is so called as a shell, this shell is a hard nut to crack by ourselves. This kind of takes care of all the data, low level things. But on the flip side, if you use Xilinx tools, then everything becomes easy, but the core architecture specification becomes the pain. Okay. So those of you who are curious, those of you, who want to explore a bit more, do research more, I strongly advise you, it will not be part of the course. I strongly advise you to take a look at BSV and Chisel. Okay. Maybe, as a part of the course project, if someone can do, do something using BlueSpec, using HLS and, whatever that you learn in the course, and then see if we can do similar thing in Chisel, that would be a very good project also. Okay. Great. So now let's go to the revisit the first problem that we have seen in today's lecture, that is there is a we are bound by the communication complexity, not the communication complexity. The communication overhead is substantial. Only 2/3 of the time we are moving in data, and 1/3 of the time we are doing computation. So what is happening here is, so let me share how do we fix this problem. So we have to overlap communication and computation. That is the goal. How do we overlap communication and computation? That is the next challenge. So we will look at this code in a bit detail, but broadly, before we get started, what I would like you to, this is what is the problem. So we have, so this is the host. From host, we are transferring data, and here we are doing the computation. So let me use computation green color for computation. So we are doing computation, and then again we are doing communication. So this is host. This is FPGA. So the green is the computation happening on the FPGA, and and then there is communication going from host to FPGA. Computation is over. So I drew them as equal boxes because the ratio is approximately 1:2 in terms of time. So if we can somehow manage, to, as this computation is happening, this is the first data transfer D1 is happening. As the data transfer D1 is happening here, and then there is computation C1 happening here. So as computation C1 is happening, if we can do the second data transfer D2, if you overlap the second data transfer D2, with C1, then by the time C1 finishes, then what happens is this data D2 is available for C2 here. This data D2 is available for C2 here. Okay. So if you are able to do this thing, no, and again, this is data transfer. Maybe let's assume that that the PCI read and write lanes they can be done in parallel. So this is let me use this as RD1, RD2. This is WD1, and so maybe RD3 can also happen in parallel. So then by the time C2 starts computation, then no, the data is available. And similarly, by the time we do C3 computation, so this data D3 is available here, so on and so forth. So the goal is overlap, communication, and computation. That's the goal. So this is our primary goal. We want to overlap computation and communication. That's our goal. And so this is a code example from the White's introduction tutorial, which I strongly recommend you to take a look at it. In fact, yeah, you will do it as a part of homework anyways. So here in this particular example, what happens here is, so let's go through this code quickly. So here on line number 160, this is host code. This is host code. On line number 160, the XCL bin file, that is the hardware file, which we would like to flash on the FPGA. We use this to flash. This is a file that is available on the file system, and we use this to write it onto the FPGA. So when you write it, when you write this for the first time, it will take some time. This is in fact flashing takes good amount of time on the FPGA. It could be your bottleneck if you are doing it for the first time. If your program exits after you run this program, and if your program exits, the design still sits on the FPGA. It's not going to get erased. Usually, what happens in on the programs on CPU, once the program exits, the memory that is allocated to the program is gone and all, right? That is true still for the host code, but the hardware design still remains on the FPGA. So when you write this program again, and when you try to flash the FPGA using line number 160, the function initialize will check whether that is already flashed. If it is already flashed, it doesn't do a reflash of that design onto FPGA. All right. And then on line number 162, you create a command queue, and then you create. You are working with the kernel wide underscore VAR. So keep this. We are getting a handle to the kernel. So these are the two things that we are doing. So we will just keep going down. What I would like you to focus here is on line numbers 237 to 240. So here, what we do is, we are taking this A underscore buff, B underscore buff, C underscore buffs. They are, they are memory. There are arrays, okay, they are buffers, okay. They are subdivided into sub buffers, into smaller buffers, into chunks. They are divided into, and the pointer to each of the sub buffers is present in A underscore buffers, B underscore buffs, and C underscore buffs. If you look at the data type of this, this you can see It's a vector of buffers. It's a vector of buffers. So each element in A underscore buffs, it points to a subbuffer. Okay. So we divide the original buffer into subbuffers. Okay. And then what we do is this is the place where we enqueue the tasks, okay, that we would like the FPGA to do. Like now, let's go to the function 245, which is enqueue subbuff underscore v add, and so just we will see what is there in that function, but you can see that. But if we divided our whole array into, let's say, 100 subbuffs, then we will be calling this 100 times. So what happens is every time we call this function, so we enqueue the input subbuffers and we launch the kernel, and we also launch a data memory copy operation from FPGA to host. So as a part of this, three things will happen every time we launch this. So we launch three things in the command queue. One is host to FPGA data transfer. Number two, kernel launch. Number three is FPGA to host. All these three things we launch, we enqueue in the, we put in the command queue. So this thing gets repeated if there are 10, if we divided our original computation into 10 parts, then this sequence gets called 10 times. And after they get launched, it's an all asynchronous thing. So you just have to come here on line number 249 in order to wait for all these things to over. In order to check that, in order to see that all these things are, these launched commands are over. One important thing that I would like you to understand, to pay attention is the kernel should execute only after the host to FPGA memcopy is over, and the FPGA to host copy should be this should be over. This should be launched only after the kernel execution finishes. So there is a dependency between these three. Okay, let's say for subbuffer 0, SB for subbuffer 0, we launched these three. So there is a dependency between these three. You cannot do anything about it. Similarly, for subbuffer 1, the same thing will repeat. H2F and kernel launch. And number 3, FPGA to host. All these three.
One query, sir. Here, subbuffer 1 is launched only after writing into DDR, right?
After writing what into?
Means the output of the computation into
the second. So
yes,
good
sir.
question, Prithvi. So I will answer your question. Okay. Understood your question. So within subbuffer 1, there is this dependency, but there is no dependency between, if you see, between this and this, there is no dependency. Okay. So we should be able to launch this without waiting for this to finish. Okay, host to. But all these things, they are all individual commands enqueued. So we should initialize the command queue in such a way by using a flag which says allow. There is some flag which says allow out of order execution. Sorry.
Means concurrent command queues, kind of.
It's only one command queue, but you just permit it as allow out of order execution.
I understand, sir. Then the second subbuffer will be launched parallelly.
Yeah, will be launched even before the first one.
Completion of the task.
Yeah, before the completion of that task.
Yes.
And the system doesn't know magically that, that this is independent of this. You have to create the dependency between this and, wherever there is a dependency, like for example, the dependency between kernel launch and H2F, and the dependency between F2H and kernel launch, you have to create the dependency because the system doesn't know that such dependency exists.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Correct.
So if you go look at the code, the code, I think I am just giving a big picture. But broadly speaking, the whole thing, if you see here, whenever you are enqueuing a thing, the last parameter here, it kind of sets up a dependency. Okay, that this particular thing, you have to chain the events. You have to chain the events, and I am not at this today, at least I will not be able to explain you clearly how we are able to chain the events between, how we are able to synchronize these command launches by using events. Okay, but the important point is there is a mechanism for us to kind of specify that this 2 depends on 1 and 3 depends on 2, and 1 is independent of 1. Step 1 of SB1 is independent of F2H. So all these things are possible. So essentially what we do is we kind of create a DAG of tasks by using there's a command queue, and we enqueue all the commands, but we create a dependency explicitly. The system doesn't know. We have to create this dependency. And when we create this dependency, then wherever these parallel tasks are possible, the system will go ahead and execute. Okay. How exactly this dependency, this DAG is established using events, using, so we will see in the next class. Okay. So this is the summary picture. By using this approach, we will be able to overlap communication and computation. So that is the summary picture for today's lecture. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm just thinking if I forgot anything else here. So if you see, just to kind of make it clear, there is this initialize function. We are initializing, a couple of remarks I will make and then we'll break for today. So there is this initialize, go to command queue. If you see, let me clear all my drawings. So if I hover my mouse on get command queue, you will see that in_order is equal to false. That is, we are telling that to create a command queue where in-order execution of commands is not necessary. Okay, so remember that. That is one. Yeah, so I think that's about it. Yeah. So to summarize, we learned a couple of important ideas from today's class. One is Amdahl's law. It's very important, and we used it to kind of understand communication versus computation. And that remember that Amdahl's law kind of works for not only this case. In many cases, let's say you are reading a big file from the hard disk, doing computation, and then writing it back to the hard disk. The in-memory computation you can do so fast, but if your hard disk access is a bottleneck, then no, you are not going to get much. Okay, so the Amdahl's law, and then second thing is data flow computations. How multiple modules can be connected with each other by using FIFOs. That is second important thing. Third is hiding the overlap, communication, and overlap. These are the three important things: compute and communication. by chaining the events, okay, using OpenCL, the framework that is given to us. So these are the three important things that we have seen in today's lecture. Okay. So with this, I will stop. Yeah. So if you have any questions, you may ask. Otherwise,
Sir, in this pipelined approach where you're overlapping the computation and communication, since we know that the communication time is much greater than what the computation time is, how much will pipeline actually improve the performance?
so good question, Abhishek. So we don't know. See, what happens is that is what is called as a design space exploration problem. So let's say for a particular data size, let's say the subbuffer size, so we divided it into subbuffer size, right? So let's call it as SBZ subbuffer. SB is subbuffer. So for a particular subbuffer, so you have C of SB is the computation time, and D of SB is the data transfer time. How do we choose for different values of SB? These two may change, and what we would like to do is we would like to choose a value of SB so that these two is roughly equal. Sometimes it is possible, sometimes it may not be possible, but if you are able to do something like that, it will be good. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So I will, that's all for today. See you on Saturday.